After years of stalled efforts, President Obama's trip to the Middle East has once again raised hopes of restarting the peace process. Can we expect a breakthrough? Next on the line. This is On the Line, and I'm Aisha Tanzeem. Mideast peace, one of the thorniest issues in global politics, no doubt. And for the last few years, even the efforts for the parties to sit down and talk were stalled. And yet, the recent trip by President Barack Obama has raised hopes again. Let's find out from our guests what that means. Joining me are Omar Mother, a political analyst on Middle East affairs, and Rubin, the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the Ploughshares Fund. Gentlemen, welcome to the show, and I will start with you, Omar. What is different? Why are people more hopeful now?
I think President Obama's speech was unprecedented. We've never had a sitting American president go into such detail about the injustice Palestinians live under the Israeli occupation, calling on an Israeli audience to look through Palestinian eyes at what living through this conflict means, and calling on young Israelis essentially to challenge their political leadership, to push them to make a real peace agreement with the Palestinians. So that is definitely unprecedented and something that would naturally give people hope. At the same time, I want to be clear about the fact that at the end of the day, this is only a speech. The two-state solution is more or less on the verge of collapse at this point, and it's definitely going to take more than a speech to get it moving again. We've definitely gotten a little bit closer by a hopeful speech, but now it's time for policy to shift to accommodate that hope.
It was unprecedented, Joel. He went over the head of the Israeli government. He talked directly to the youth in Israel and said, you need to push your government to make hard decisions. But as Umar said, at the end of the day, it was just a speech. How much difference will it make?
Well, Aisha, the speech itself was very dramatic. It was one which demonstrated to not just Israelis who were listening and watching, but also to the international community that Israelis do yearn for peace. And the president was able to put forward in his discussion the idea that the Palestinians have rights, that there is a need for justice for their cause. He also framed it within a very strong frame of support by the United States for Israel, saying essentially that we have your back, Israel, and we're going to be there for you as you take the risks that you need to take. So a speech does not resolve everything. It never has. But what matters now is whether or not the leaders of Israel, of the Palestinians, of the United States take advantage of this window where all the sides seem to be saying that was really great, and we want to see if we can get at this again.
Now, he mentioned it, Joel mentioned it, Omar, and I want to come to you about, people in Israel really want peace? People on the Palestinian side want peace. There are enough surveys out there to say that the majority of the population would support it. And yet we don't see any development on that front. Let's talk about it in the context of the recent Israeli elections and what that means. What does that vote show to the world about what the Israeli people want?
You're absolutely correct in that an overwhelming majority of both Israelis and Palestinians are in favor of a two-state peace agreement. The problem has always been with the makeup of the Israeli political system, and that you always need broad coalitions in order to have a government. And that invariably includes having to take on the Israeli settler movement into the coalition, which makes it very difficult for Israel to withdraw from the occupied territories or take any serious action against settlement expansion in the Palestinian territories. That has been the primary problem. At the same time, within the context of Israeli elections, I think we saw that the Palestinian issue was more or less absent. Even though the population is in favor of a peace agreement, this was not a big part of the political campaigns, and we've also seen that it's not a big part of the outcome of these elections, in that all the political coalition that was formed at the end of the day is not necessarily one that is in favor of a two-state peace agreement, even though the population does support it. You have people like Naftali Bennett, who is right now on the ministerial committee for the peace process, who's very open about the fact that he's opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state. So as long as you have these kinds of people who are an integral part of any Israeli governing coalition, it's going to be very difficult to imagine how that's going to change Israeli policy towards the Palestinians.
Now, you've raised two important points. Let me address it one by one. And Joel, I want you to address the first one, which is the settlers. They're an important part of this whole process, and yet, you know, they're against the peace process. How does Netanyahu or any Israeli government handle that?
Well, I think we have to be very clear about who's for and against the peace process. In a general way, most Israelis support a two-state solution. What they want to know are the details. They want to know what the borders will be, what the security arrangements will be. They want to understand the status of Jerusalem. There are many issues on the table that are going to be very complicated. And the settler community itself is not monolithic. They are a strong constituency in Israeli politics. They have a representation in the Knesset, in the Israeli parliament. They do have members in the government and in very powerful posts. They're going to need to be part of any solution that takes place for it to be politically acceptable in Israel. And I think what we're going to see in the days ahead is this question of how far can Netanyahu go with his current coalition? Will he need to reach out to the opposition parties, the Labor Party, which is leading the opposition in the parliament? What can he do to manage this? Interestingly, Netanyahu now finds himself to be squarely in the center of Israeli politics. And with the wind at his back from the president's visit, he may see some windows to move. That said, it's going to take two to tango, and it's going to require a real Israeli-Palestinian direct discussion for these questions to be answered.
Now, to the second point, Omar, that you raised, why is it that the peace between Israel and the Palestinians, which to the world looks like the biggest issue in the region, was not part of the political discourse during the elections?
I think the Palestinian population lives the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in a very direct way in their daily lives. They live under occupation. They live, you know, under siege in the Gaza Strip as well. So it's very difficult for them to ignore and pretend like the conflict does not exist. I think for most Israelis, Israel's security systems have been sufficiently effective that I think it's just put the entire conflict out of the minds of the Israeli population at large. They don't feel the consequences of the conflict going on. So it's very easy to just ignore the issue, to say it's very difficult to imagine how a political solution could come about given the fact that it's failed so many times. So let's just forget about it and focus on the issues that impact our lives, which are economic issues and many other social issues that affect their lives. But I don't think that's sustainable. That's not a long-term thing. It's very difficult to imagine that Palestinians can continue living under occupation with settlements continuing to expand without there being another major outbreak of violence or something. So even though I think it's easy to put it out of their minds for the time being, I think it is going to be very important to resolve this before there's another major outbreak in violence.
And Joel, do you think the sense of urgency is there?
Well, Omar is right. The Israelis for the past several years have been focused more on Iran and concerns about its nuclear program. They've been very concerned about the changes in the Arab world from the Arab awakening. What's the future of Egypt? What's going to happen in Syria? These are very dominant in Israeli security discourse. But yes, the urgency of a settlement with the Palestinians, that has been, while that has been lacking, that's clear when one listens to the leading policymakers, former heads of the Shin Bet, the Israeli intelligence services. They all understand that there's a demographic issue from their perspective that they're very worried about, which is that within a couple of decades, the majority of those people living between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River will be majority Arab. And from a Jewish democratic perspective for the state of Israel, that's very troubling. They do need to take care of this problem before it overwhelms them. But yes, as Omar said, it has not been the #1 issue for security concerns that Israel's been most focused on.
Out of sight, out of mind, in a way, because the security, as he said, the Israeli security arrangements have been very successful in stopping the suicide bombings and the attacks, and that in turn has made people think like the problem's not as...
But it always flares up when one least expects it, and as we've seen over the past several years, conflicts arise out of thin air in many ways, although it's not really out of thin air, but certainly from Gaza in particular, that situation is dire for the people in Gaza. And there are military actions that take place and rocket fire, and Israelis are always aware of it. They may be burying it a little bit under the surface of their overall national political discussion, but they're not completely oblivious.
Now, Omar, there are 3 other members in the quartet. U.S. is not the only one, but we haven't heard much about the other ones in a while. No UN, no Russia, no European Union. What's happening with that?
I think the quartet, I mean, it's suffers the same fate of anybody who's tried to mediate Israeli-Palestinian peace talks has always had, is that their political positions seem to make perfect sense. What they're calling for is perfectly reasonable, but they have no means of leverage, no means of pressure. I think as long as the United States has provided vetoes at the UN Security Council nearly 50 times to protect Israel from any action or pressure from the international community based on their violations of Palestinian rights or because of their settlement expansion. And you have ongoing American diplomatic and military support for Israel. That just gives them no incentive to make any compromises. And I think without any ability to put pressure on Israel, it's going to be very difficult for anybody who is trying to mediate this conflict to get any traction, because even though they're saying the right things, without leverage, there's simply not going to be any change on the ground.
Although, Joel, with the record of UN having, as Omar pointed out, 50 resolutions that U.S. vetoed against, Israel would not trust UN as a mediator, would it?
Right, and I think what the Obama administration has learned from the last 4 years is that the concept of pure pressure is not working, did not work, certainly in the case of Israel in pressuring against the settlement expansion. That created significant political blowback here. So blowback here and no real change on the ground. So what the administration has tried to do is to pivot and point out how its strong relationship in support of Israeli security over the past 4 years is a point of strength and commonality. And the president himself used that as a real baseline for his discussions with Prime Minister Netanyahu, the intent being that Israelis should understand broadly, not just at the governmental level, but broadly at the national level, that the United States is going to be there with Israel as it makes tough choices for peace, and that its security will be protected.
This is On the Line, and I'm Aisha Tanseem. We're talking about the prospects of peace between Israel and the Palestinians in light of recent developments. Our guests are Omar Baddar, a political analyst on Middle East affairs, and Joel Rubin, the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the Ploughshares Fund. Let's talk about what the recent Obama trip in the Middle East meant. Secretary Kerry, John Kerry, right after President Obama left, went right back to talk to both sides. Does it look like, Omar, to you that this administration is more focused on Middle East than the previous Obama administration under Hillary Clinton?
I think it is. I mean, we've seen in the first term, Obama started with demanding very strongly an end to settlement expansion, and then slowly essentially backed down from that demand after he realized that the political cost was going to be too significant to pay. I think the Republican Congress would have made it very difficult for President Obama to apply any real pressure. And we've seen clashes within the administration. George Mitchell, who was the Middle East envoy at the time, was not getting along with Dennis Ross, and things just were not clicking in terms of trying to get any traction on the ground. So it remains to be seen. I mean, there's certainly, it's obvious that there is a commitment to try to push the peace process forward. The fact that Kerry is there during Obama and after Obama left, Kerry stayed behind to try to get some traction, clearly shows that there is a level of commitment. But again, I can't emphasize this enough. At the end of the day, beyond just talk, is there going to be any meaningful pressure? Let us remember the fact that Israel is the single largest recipient of U.S. foreign aid. It's, you know, the major U.S. client in the region. And given the fact that it is so dependent on U.S. military aid and diplomatic support, that gives the United States plenty of leverage to try to pressure them to get something moving on the ground. I don't think calling for a resumption of negotiations while settlements continue to expand is kind of like telling somebody to negotiate with their business partner how they're going to provide, you know, how divide the profits of a business deal, while one side is actively taking money out of the other person's account. It just makes no sense when we're talking about ending the occupation to say, let's just talk about it while the settlements continue expanding, because we've already had that through 7 years peace process from '93 to 2000, and we've seen what the outcome was.
Joel, it seems like you want to add something to it.
Well, I just say that we need to have a realistic process going forward, and that's one that's rooted in American politics, Israeli politics, Palestinian politics. Any process to succeed is going to have to ensure that all the parties to this feel like they get something out of it. And the path of pressuring Israel to make concessions is not a fruitful one. It doesn't work, and it doesn't make Israel come to the table. This other path, the one that the president's laid out, of arguing that the United States is with Israel and its security, but it needs to understand this is in their interest, and at the same time going to President Abbas, understanding and seeing for himself. The president saw the security barrier. He understood, he heard from Palestinians, he understood the daily difficulties and gets the strategic implications of the need for a peace deal. He and his State Department now have to lean in to that issue and, in a sense, mobilize the forces in these countries that they're calling on. I don't believe that we've seen a successful process go forward without the populations themselves really engaged, and certainly in the 90s when Israel and the Palestinians were making moves towards each other, there was a significant amount of public support for those moves. That's part of what the president and the administration needs to rekindle.
Okay, so now you're talking about, and Omar, I'll come to you. I know you want to add something to it. You're talking about American politics, Israeli politics,
yes,
and Palestinian politics, and I want to address each of them separately, starting, Joel, with American politics, which is, you know, it's been almost a norm that criticizing Israel was synonymous to losing elections and being called anti-Semitic.
Right.
That seems to be changing. AIPAC used to be the strongest voice on the Hill, and now there are alternative voices, J Street being one of them. You were one of the founding members. Tell me how that's impacting American foreign policy.
Well, American foreign policy really is rooted in American interests, and arguing for the best way forward for American policy must be grounded in a clear view of what's happening in the region. And the United States Middle East policy has been dominated for the past decade by issues like terrorism in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan. And so what we're seeing in Washington is an exhaustion of American policy in the Middle East, a real uncertainty about the way forward, especially during this transition period in the Arab world. And so when constituent groups come to the Capitol and they go to the White House and they go to the State Department and they ask for the American government to take a position, the American government wants to know, well, where's the political support for this, because our people are tired. And that's where the debate now is heading in Washington. We saw it during the nomination for Secretary of Defense Hagel, who was confirmed, where he was attacked for taking positions that were very clear-eyed about American interests in the Middle East, and he was able to rebut those attacks and get confirmed. Hopefully we'll see more of that pushback against the jargon and the ideological arguments, and more about what's in our interest. And it is in the American interest to see a resolution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Now, Omar, you wanted to add something to that, but while you're doing that, also let's talk about the Palestinian politics, which is Fatah and Hamas don't really get along with each other. So who is the partner with whom you deal for a peace process?
There is no question that the fact that the Palestinian political leadership is currently divided is a problem. At the end of the day, as long as that political leadership is divided, you're not going to get any kind of lasting agreement, because, like you said, if you agree with one party and not the other, then does that really hold? I mean, obviously the answer is it would be on very shaky grounds. That definitely is up for the Palestinians to sort out, and I think it's very important for them to sort it out as soon as possible. I also want to add that it is indeed true that it is in the Israeli interest, in the Palestinian interest, and in the American interest for there to be a peace agreement. So it makes sense that all of these parties have an interest in trying to get this to come about. I would completely agree with Joel, had we been back in the 90s, to say that soft diplomacy and bringing everybody to the table, you know, in good faith and talking about interests would be the way to go. But I think that ignores the urgency of where we are today. The two-state solution really is on the verge of collapse. The extent of Israel's integration of the Palestinian territories into Israel, the extent of the settlement expansion with over 600,000 settlers now living in the occupied territories, puts very significant urgency that I think the time to just talk it's a bit late for that. It's really time for real pressure. Currently, I think it would be fair to say that we have, in effect, a system of apartheid in place because Israel controls all of the territories and the Palestinians don't have sufficient rights. If there's not going to be a separate Palestinian state, then we're going to be talking about the prospect of having a one-state solution. If we end up moving in that direction, either the Palestinians get full equal rights, in which case Israel ceases to be a Jewish state, or the Palestinians don't get equal rights, and Israel ceases to be truly democratic and becomes essentially an apartheid state.
And Joel, Omar raises a very good point. I was going to come to that. If this matter is not addressed urgently, would we not automatically move towards a one-state solution because there won't be enough territory left in the Palestinian areas?
And that's why it is an urgent issue, and that's why the president went out there. This was his first trip abroad in his new second term. This is significant that the President of the United States said to the American people, I believe we need to get involved in this. He didn't say, here's what every side should do or require them to meet certain benchmarks, but he did put a marker down and said, to me, this is important. I have my team in place. I have John Kerry here. I have a Secretary of State now paying attention to this. That's at a level of of bureaucratic power that we have not seen coming to this issue in some time, where the Secretary of State has been personally charged with running this issue. So we'll see in the days ahead how this goes forward. But I don't believe that talking is for nothing. I do believe that essentially we are going to need to see the two sides talk through an agreement. Generally, both sides accept the contours of what an agreement will look like. They now have to agree that that is exactly where they want to head.
Omar, if both sides are brought back to the table, do they have a clear agenda of what they want by themselves? Because usually when they come to the table, there's a lot of wrangling, and I don't know how much clarity is there. I
think it's primarily about the balance of power between the two parties that makes these negotiations very difficult. We've seen revelations through the Palestine papers that were leaked to Al Jazeera at the beginning of 2011. We've seen transcripts of what these negotiations go like, and it looked like the Palestinians were willing to bend over backwards to accommodate, the existence of many Israeli settlements and claims on parts of East Jerusalem and so on. But that still did not achieve an agreement, because I think Israel, negotiating from a position of power, they're in favor of the creation of something that could be called a Palestinian state, just to contain what they view as the demographic threat of having a Palestinian population there. But I don't think that they're necessarily in favor, given the fact that they don't feel the urgency to do it, to grant the realization of a viable Palestinian state, a real Palestinian state that has sovereignty, that has control over its borders, its water, its airspace, and so on.
Okay, so let me, since we're coming towards the end, last 30 seconds, Joel, even if a Palestinian state is created and it's not viable, it doesn't serve Israel's interest, does it? Because Israel is still going to have a large Arab population living in its territories. How it's going to treat that?
Well, what the Israeli government should want, and what the Israeli people want, is a viable Palestinian state that can live side by side in peace and security. That's the end goal. That's the objective for these discussions, hopefully, that will begin to commence again. A Palestinian state that is not secure, that can't control its territory, that can't provide security for its people and be a safe neighbor to Israel, that's not one where the Israelis want to head.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank our guests, Omar Baddar, a political analyst on Middle East affairs, and Joel Rubin, the Director of Policy and Government Affairs at the Ploughshares Fund. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you'll join us again next week for On the Line.